appreciate that. So I am going to talk about what is physicalism today. Physicalism, I'll just say, this is important to me that I can figure out what's the right way to state the view. And I'm starting to write a book on physicalism right now, so I'll be really interested in hearing the discussion and your criticisms of the way I'm presenting things. But physicalism is something that's guided all of my work. I mean, we can state it really simply at first as just the view that the world is the way physics says it is. But what I'm going to be trying to argue here is that that really simple characterization is not really going to work out, and we do have problems with it just simply saying the world is the way physics says it is. But it's important to get clear on this, and this isn't just kind of my pet view. In philosophy, physicalism is guided work in metaphysics and philosophy of science and philosophy of mind and ethics. It's something that in the early 20th century, or in the early 21st century, Barry Lower and Carl Gillett in a book on the topic called Our Contemporary Weltanschauung. This is like supposed to be what's guiding a lot of our research, not just in philosophy, but in science and different areas of science and discussions of what there is, what's important, does God exist. So I think it's really important to justify physicalism, and I have other work talking about that, but what I'm going to be talking about here isn't why should we be physicalists, but more, can we even be physicalists? Is there even a position here that's worth talking about? So to start off, I just want to place physicalism against some other views that are roughly in the same ballpark of topics. So there are lots of comprehensive metaphysical views that have been defended. This was something that surprised me as an undergraduate that was definitely very interested in physics. I would have thought that a view like a materialism, the view that everything's matter, would have been the kind of mainstream view that was the most popular over the history of philosophy and science, but surprisingly not so much. Well, when you look at the history of philosophy, you see idealism, the view that everything is ideas or everything is somehow something mental. It's been much more popular over the history of philosophy. Materialism, the view, I'm putting a picture of a desk up here because I feel like that's the best example we can have of some material object. The view that everything's matter has been defended sporadically over the history of philosophy, but it's not been historically the most influential. Dualism is another comprehensive worldview we can look at that would say there are things that are mental, there are things that are ideas, there are things that are material also. Both kinds of things exist. And then, people have defended all kinds of other metaphysical views, comprehensive metaphysical views saying everything is this way. So Pythagoreanism seems to come up again and again, and there are some physicists that have been interested recently in bringing this back and saying, yeah, everything's fundamentally mathematical. Of these positions, I didn't even try to put some kind of pantheism up here, because I didn't want to have to find a piece of clip art for that. But the view that is most similar to physicalism, that a lot of people will say, this is the historical predecessor to physicalism, is materialism. Physicalism, sometimes people will use the terms physicalism and materialism interchangeably and just say this is just like a more contemporary, exciting name for the same position. But I want to emphasize there is a difference between materialism and physicalism, and the reason is it's true that people who have been materialists over the history of philosophy, like Hobbes, for example, who's somebody who defended a position like this in the early modern period, did see themselves as guided in what they believed existed by the science of the day. But usually today, a physicalist won't say that it's right to say everything is matter, like a materialist will, right? That's just how I'm understanding materialism, the view that everything's matter. The reason is because matter kind of comes with particular connotations. If I'm talking about matter, one thing is I'm talking about something that's solid, something like a table. Whereas the kinds of things that physics talks about today, a lot of those things aren't solid. You can't describe an electromagnetic field or a proton or a bit of space-time as solid. Historically, when people talk about, philosophers talk about matter, they're talking about something, Descartes defined matter as something that's spatially extended. That's, again, in physics, we have point particles. They're not spatially extended in any way by definition. So matter, to say everything's matter, no longer strikes a lot of people as correct, as like a promising way to think this is what everything is. And so one of the ways of seeing the shift from materialism to physicalism in the 20th century is by philosophers saying, you know what, I don't want to say, I can't say exactly what the kind of thing is that physics talks about. Some of it might seem more like matter, other things don't. Space-time doesn't really seem like something that's matter, but it seems like general relativity is telling us that's the kind of thing that exists. So what we'll do is we want to, like the materialists were, we'll be informed in what exists by our best scientific theories, by physics in particular, but we're not going to restrict that to a certain kind of thing, like the materialist would, to say everything has to be like that, everything has to be material. We'll just say the world is the way physics says it is. And however that turns out to be, whether it includes space-time, whether it includes little particles, whether it includes fields, we'll let the physics guide what we believe exists. So that's where I started. That's the rough idea of physicalism. So the physicalist believes the world is the way physics says it is. What's the problem with that? Well, the first immediate obvious problem with saying, I'm a physicalist, so I believe the world is the way physics says it is that there are all kinds of like obvious things that physics just doesn't talk about. So physics doesn't say anything about rabbits or pineapples or water bottles or markers, or it doesn't mention any of those things. So if I just say the world's the way physics says it is, then it looks like I've got a very, very restricted view about the kinds of things that exist. Now, you can be a physicalist and think that. There are physicalists who say, no, really, that's what I believe. I only believe in the kinds of things physics talks about. So I believe in electrons, but I don't believe in tables. I believe in fields, electromagnetic fields, but I don't believe in myself, because physics doesn't talk about human beings. There are people who have those views, and I think it takes a lot of courage to defend a view like that, but there's no reason for a physicalist to necessarily adopt that position. So the simple fix that we can say is that's too quick. You shouldn't say, just to begin with, if you're going to be a physicalist, you should, or let me not say necessarily if you're going to be a physicalist, but if you want to understand what physicalism is, you don't have to just simply understand it as the view that the world is the way physics says it is, because you should allow that physics doesn't talk about a whole lot of things that exist. But that's okay, because physics isn't trying to talk about everything that exists. What it's trying to talk about are the fundamental things. And so the better view is to say, a better way of understanding physicalism is as the view that the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is. And now this opens up some problems, because we have to understand what does that mean? What's this fundamentally word doing here? And that's something that for a while, it seemed like in the 20th century, philosophers didn't really want to talk about so much. But there are some views, and so I'm just going to talk about a couple of ways of fleshing this out. So what do we mean when we say the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is? What does it mean to say that physics is fundamental? So one picture, this is a picture that is associated with a paper by the philosophers Paul Oppenheim and Hilary Putnam from the 1950s called The Unity of Science as a Working Hypothesis, which is one of my favorite papers, but it's a much maligned paper today because it defends a particular very strong version of reductionism. And reductionism is apparently a dirty word. But I like this paper. But this is here's one view about what we mean when we say the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is. The way you can think of this is you think about the sciences as somehow ordered into levels. And so you've got physics at the bottom, right? Because it's the fundamental theory, it's the foundations of all the other sciences. And then you've got chemistry and you've got these other sciences. And how are they ordered? How do they get ordered into levels? Well, the way that works is you start by thinking about the kinds of entities that the different sciences talk about. This is what Oppenheim and Putnam are doing. So you look at the different sciences and you see each one of those comes with a domain of objects that it talks about. And I did this, and well, this is part of the problem with the view, is how do you even start to do this and say, that's what biology talks about, just that stuff. But this is roughly what Oppenheim and Putnam were thinking. So physics will talk about subatomic particles, and then chemistry will talk about the atoms and the molecules. And then you get to biology, and it talks about the things that atoms and molecules make up, right? So you have the cell biology, and then you'll have the biology that talks about what the cells make up, and then you get organisms, and then you have the science that talks about what those things make up, and so on. And economics will be up there also, and the other social sciences, anthropology, up there at the point. And so what you have is these sciences ordered by complexity. So you start with the most simple objects, and then at each level, you get to a science that describes the kinds of things that are built up out of the entities at the levels below. So that's a view. So if you have this view, then we can make sense of the claim that the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is. What we're saying is, really, everything that there is everything that there is either just is things that are described by physics, or are more complex things that are built up out of the things that are described by physics. So that's a picture that you could have, and you could just make sense of the claim. Physicalism is the view that the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is. Now, like I said, this is controversial. People don't like this. Let me just give you one reason. So I've already kind of mentioned one reason why you might be skeptical of this picture, and that's that it presumes that there is some way to carve up the science into these levels, that the sciences have subject matters that can be arranged in this way. Another kind of worry you might have, this is what I'm a little more sympathetic to, is the idea that there are lots of sciences do have subject matters, but they're not the kinds of things that can properly be seen as just like built up out of subatomic particles. So like if you think about universities, okay, so universities would be something that sociologists might want to talk about. Is the right way to think about universities as just conglomerations of subatomic particles? If that seems a little bit too simple. It seems like, of course, there are electrons involved. Like, we're in a university, there are electrons around here. But it's not like what it is to be a university is just to have a bunch of these things stuck together, arranged in a particular way. It involves some kind of more complex functioning. Another case you might think of as like Facebook. So that's another kind of social networks, stock markets, all these kinds of things that maybe economists want to talk about or sociologists want to talk about. Those are the subject matter of social sciences, but to think about these things as even these kinds of physical objects that are carved up in this way out of these things is controversial. And you might say the same thing about minds, which are the subject matter of psychology and mental states. So this is a controversial reason. This is a reason to think that maybe this isn't the right way to understand physicalism. But I'm just gonna move on and give you another picture that maybe does a little bit better. And this has been more, taken a little bit more seriously, I think, recently in metaphysics as the right way to think about fundamentality. So here, if I say the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is, I'm not gonna say anything about entities. I'm not gonna talk about particles or cells or anything like that. I'm just going to talk about theories and the claims in these different theories. And so here the idea is to say that the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is, or to say that physics is somehow fundamental, is just to say that it provides an explanatory basis for all the claims that we would make. And not just the claims that we can make that are true in the sciences, but also in common sense. So if I say there's a water bottle on the table, I don't know, that's common sense. Water bottles go in the recycle bin. That's common sense. That's a claim that's true, and then the thought would be, why is physics fundamental? Because that and all these other true claims all have some kind of explanatory basis in physics. So that's been a picture of fundamentality that's been influential not just in philosophy, but when you look at physicists talking about what it is for there to be such a thing as a fundamental physical theory, or a final theory, as the physicist Steven Weinberg argued, this is the way they tend to think. So the story is, what makes physics fundamental? What makes physics fundamental is you can make claims, ordinary claims, you can make claims in all these different sciences, but it's always possible to ask, why is that the case? And then when you get an answer to that, why is that the case, you can follow that with another why question, why is that the case? And what he argues is, all of these different from all these different starting points about why is this the case, and why is this the case, and why is this the case, you can ultimately trace all these back to answers in one theory, and that'll be your fundamental physical theory. So I have the picture of him in front of a chalkboard, and this is a kind of example he uses in this book, Dreams of a Final Theory, where he was arguing that there could be a final physical theory, a fundamental physical theory. In this book, he's arguing that because he's trying to convince us that it's worth spending a lot of money to build the kind of accelerators and large equipment that are actually required to answer these kinds of questions. Because if you're really going to do the kind of physics that he's interested in, this is going to cost a lot of money. So it was really high stakes here for him to be arguing that physics is fundamental. But the example he uses is just a piece of chalk. So we don't have chalk here, but if you ask, he said, if you ask any question about this chalk, why is it white? Why does it have this composition? Why is it reflect light in this kind of, well, obviously that has a physics answer, but all these questions can ultimately be traced back to an answer in physics. And so one thing I'll just point out, because an obvious thing you want to say is, no, you can't give explanations for everything in terms of physics. That's too hard. I'll never be able to understand the mind just directly in terms of physics. I think this was clear in the kind of examples I was giving, but the thought isn't that if I ask you something about why does the mind work this way, or why does Twitter evolve in the way that it does, that you're somehow just going to be able to give an explanation in terms of physics, and that's the end. These stories, these explanations are, this is to use a phrase of the philosopher of science Kenneth Schaffner, creeping rather than sweeping. So the thought is that you can somehow always get back to physics as a source of explanations for any kind of question, but these explanations might have to go through various levels of explanation. So you might, if you're going to answer a question about the mind, or let's just say if you're going to answer a question about social network, you're going to have to go through questions about minds, which is going to require you to go through questions about biologies, and that's going to require you to go through questions about chemistries, and that's going to require, then you can get to physics. So these explanatory arrows don't really point like the way I had here, directly from physics, but that's another conception. So if we have this picture, I think that's a way to give us a sense of what it means to say the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is, without saying anything anybody wants to talk about is just like something that's just a collection of atoms or a collection of subatomic particles. So that's one question. I lost my clock. Oh, there it is. But another question that I want to talk about, that we talked about today in Torrance class, is the question of, so if we can understand fundamental, but what do we mean by physics here? So if I say the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is, there's a question, just what do I mean by physics? Because if I say I'm a physicalist, so I believe the world is fundamentally the way today's physics says it is, you can respond by saying, no, it's not, because we know today's physics isn't got all the answers. right? You can't explain everything that there is just in terms of today's physics. There are a lot of big questions that have opened up just in the past few years about, well, we still have questions about the origin of the universe. We learned there are things like dark matter and dark energy that are taking up huge volumes of what exists in our universe. We know nothing about what they are. We have problems unifying the two great theories that we have right now, quantum mechanics and general relativity, into a unified theory of quantum gravity. And these are all extremely difficult questions that it's not like we kind of have an idea how we're going to answer, or how the physicists are going to answer them. So to say that physics is done, that the world is the way current physics says it is, isn't right. So it looks like we face these options. Current physics doesn't seem to be able to give us a fundamental theory of everything there is. We have another option that we can say instead, and a lot of people have said this, that physicalism is the view that the world is fundamentally the way some future physics says it is, but this has problems too. And so this is a problem that now people refer to as Hempel's dilemma, after the philosopher of science Carl Hempel, who raised this. He was worried about logical positivists in the early 20th century who also adopted physicalism. And he raised this problem that said, well, you want to say the world is the way physics says it is, but what are you talking about? What physics are you talking about? You can't say the world is the way current physics says it is, because it's not. That's not a true, complete theory. But if you try to say the world is the way future physics says it is, like the actual physics that gets everything right, I don't know what you're talking about, because I have no idea what that theory is. So it looks like either way, we've got a serious problem. I put here, entails physicalism is meaningless or trivial. Let me talk about the triviality just quickly. So the thought that physicalism is meaningless if it's defined or understood as the view that the world is fundamentally the way some future completed physics says it is, right? It's just, we don't know what that future completed physics is. So if you tell me the world is that way, I don't know what you're talking about. The triviality worry comes from the idea that, well, the obvious thing that you want to say in response to that is, well, you know, it's the future completed physics is a theory that's like our physics, it's just the one that explains everything. But then you're like, okay, so your view is the world is the way, the theory that's just like our physics, but is actually able to explain everything is. Well, that's convenient. That just kind of makes it trivial, that of course, the world is the way whatever the true theory that explains everything says it is. But we wanted a theory that had a little more teeth, right? That it was actually making a claim that we couldn't already tell was right. So this has been a problem, and I think this is a deep difficulty with being a physicalist, given the fact that we don't have in our hands a complete physics. So you want to say the world is this way, but in some sense, you know that it's not the way the current physics is that we have. So what do you do? So what I'm going to propose here is most people actually do just say, well, it's future physics. That's the right way to understand physicalism. But I'm not convinced that that's the right way to understand it. One reason why I think going the future physics way and trying to understand physicalism in terms of a commitment to future physics isn't the right way to go is because it shouldn't be part of a physicalism that there actually ever is such a thing as a final completed physics. Okay, so we just don't know if the world is going to be such that a physical theory could actually be completed. The world might be extremely complex. We might not be able to finish physics, but that doesn't undermine the idea that if you're going to look for a complete theory, that's the right way, that's the right place to look. And so I don't think it's right to look at things this way. Instead, I think the right thing for the physicalist to do is to look at current physics. And what this will do is also allow physicalism to work the way that intuitively it should work. So physicalism was supposed to be a view that told you the way the world is. And if you look to future physics, we don't know anything about what that looks like. But if you look at current physics, we do know something about what that looks like. So if you want physicalism to be a view that guides your metaphysics, or that guides your philosophy of math, or that guides your philosophy of mind, then it needs to have some kind of concrete claims about what exists. And so that's why I'm going to suggest that we try to find a way to interpret physicalism in terms of a commitment to current physics without thereby arguing that it's false, that physicalism is false. And so the way that I've argued that we do this, I've argued this in a paper called Physicalism as an Attitude, but I'm going to be supplementing that with a little more refinements about what the physicalist attitude comes to, is instead of saying physicalism is this, physicalism is a claim, the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is, instead of that, don't interpret it as a thesis at all. Because we know it's just not true that the world is the way current physics says it is. Instead, interpret it as an attitude, meaning a complex, a psychological state. And so the proposal is going to be that there are three things that constitute this attitude. And hopefully these will just sound intuitive. Sounds like what a physicalist should believe. So the first part of the attitude is that you're a physicalist if you have the disposition to believe in the kinds of things that are best, orthodox meaning the kinds of things that are accepted amongst physicists, that are written in textbooks, that are taught to students, what these current physical theories say exist. Okay, so if they say there are electrons, then you believe in electrons. If it says there's some kind of space-time, then you believe in that. If it says there's quantum entanglement, you believe in that. That's the first component of the physicalist attitude. The second is that you have a disposition to not believe in the kinds of things that are not going to be able to be explained by these current physical theories or any future ones. So I put up here, I'm not sure what this is supposed to be, but it's something non-physical. It's something that, current physics doesn't explain, and we have good reason to believe future physical theories won't be able to explain either. So you need to have those components, but I don't think that's enough, given the fact that current physics isn't complete. Another important component of this attitude is that you have a certain expectation about future physics. So you recognize, and this is just true if we're in a state like the current state, which is that we don't have a complete physical theory. If you're a physicalist, though, you're somebody who recognizes this, but at the same time has the expectation that future physics will do better and improve at explaining what there is. So that's the physicalist attitude. I just want to emphasize that this doesn't involve the belief that we'll ever actually have a complete physics. And I think that's as it should be. So that's the position up there. I just want to raise a couple of concerns for this, and then I'll say something about why I'm not worried about these concerns so much, and then we could have Q&A. So there are a couple of concerns I have. So that one might have about this position. So I say that physicalism is this attitude, right, that involves all these kinds of behaviors, dispositions to form beliefs. But you might say, well, is that even a reasonable attitude to hold? So we know that physics, or current physics, can't provide a true theory of the world. And I've said that what's really reasonable to believe is that in order to give us a true and complete theory of the world, it's going to have to change a whole lot. There are big revolutions in our understanding that physics is going to have to go through before it could have anything like a complete theory, even if it can have a complete theory. So you might say, well, if that's true, why should I believe in anything that current physics says? The second question is, well, since I've said that physics isn't complete, why am I saying that you shouldn't believe in something if it can't be incorporated into current or future physics? Because I've left open the possibility that there are going to be things that can never be incorporated into physics. So why should the fact that something can't be incorporated into physics make it unreasonable to believe in those things? So those are the two questions. So I just want to answer these briefly. Well, this is what I think is probably the most reasonable thing to say. So the first question, granting the fact that current physics is incomplete, is it reasonable to believe in electrons? My answer is yes, because I mean this is the view that I'm arguing, that I like physicalism, and I think the best interpretation of it starts with this commitment to believing in the things that current physics talks about. Current physics talks about electrons, so yes, it's reasonable to believe in electrons. And the reason why I think this is perfectly consistent is when you think about the way that developments in physics have worked, even when we recognize that we need to have a revolution in our understanding, usually what happens isn't that the way that revolution works is everything in the previous theories get discarded and thrown out. Rather, what usually happens is, well, you know, you have this kind of theory, so we have this, right now we have this theory of subatomic particles, and what happens isn't that that is going to get tossed out, but what we do is we get a new theory that's really able to explain what's going on there. So that's what happens, and that's what we should expect in these kinds of revolutions in physics that we should be expecting over the next, hopefully, centuries. So it is reasonable to believe in electrons because you should, even if you think that the current whole physics isn't right, you should believe that even if electrons don't turn out to be fundamental, they're at least still going to be preserved in the new physics. They're just going to be explained in terms of something more fundamental. Now, it's true that sometimes when we have revolutions, entities are thrown out. They are discarded. So, for example, that's what happened with the luminiferous ether. So the thing that Maxwell thought was the medium that electromagnetic waves needed in order to wave in. We don't believe in that anymore. That got tossed out. That was a very important part of an earlier physics. But and so I think it's true, of course, some things in our current physics are going to get discarded, but the position that the physicalist is going to be in here is just to say, look, something's going to get thrown out, but I don't know what that is. And it's pretty reasonable to believe not everything's going to get thrown out. So what we're stuck with is something like basically the Preface Paradox. So the Preface Paradox is this paradox where, so this is Walter Isaacson who wrote the Steve Jobs book, and there's him with his Steve Jobs book. So I mean, this is just a problem that you have. So you write a long book, a nonfiction book. So you're supposed to be saying a whole bunch of true facts. So like Walter Isaacson learned a whole lot about Steve Jobs before he wrote this book. But it's reasonable in general for authors when they're writing nonfiction books to say, hey, I've got all these claims. I've researched all of them, so I'm giving you all of these claims, just stating them, but it's likely that at least one of them is false. Right? It's likely that at least some of them are false. So if that's reasonable for an author to say, and you know, philosophers can talk about the Preface Paradox and worry about that, epistemologists, I'm not worried about that, let them worry about that. But the physicalist just has that problem. He's got Walter Isaacson's problem. And you know, everybody else who's trying to say a whole lot about a topic. The second question is harder, so why shouldn't you believe in souls? So the thought is, if I've already acknowledged that it's very possible we'll never have a completed physics, so there are going to be things that are left out of any theory, then why shouldn't I just believe in, why am I saying that it's reasonable to say, if it can't be incorporated into physics, don't believe in it? And so this is harder. I mean, this is always the hardest part for the physicalist, not motivating your positive commitments. Why do I believe in electrons? Well, we've got a good theory. We've got a lot of evidence for current physics. But why believe in the things that you want to reject? Why not believe in the things that you want to reject? And here, there are a couple of cases. So there are different cases. So there are some things that if you're a physicalist, you don't believe in. So you don't believe in poltergeists. You don't believe in ESP. You don't believe in déjà vu. You know, that's just, I'm not saying you can if you want, but most physicalists don't believe in those things. Why? Well, the reason why they don't believe in them isn't because, in those cases, it's not because they can't be incorporated into physics. It's that the reason people believed in those things in the first place was because there were effects that it was really hard to explain in other terms. So they just said, well, why is this stuff getting moved around? Why is my lamp getting moved all over the place? And they said, a poltergeist. But then you found out, well, your kids are moving stuff around, or, why is there deja vu? We have explanations for these things. That's why it's reasonable not to believe in them anymore. So some things are like that. And then the other cases, so like phenomenal consciousness, I haven't talked about once in a talk on physicalism, which is maybe weird. But phenomenal consciousness, the kind of phenomena that a lot of people say, well, we'll have no problem explaining chemistry and biology and even lots of aspects of the mind, but phenomenal consciousness is really the problem. And we'll never be able to have a physical theory that can explain that. So that's why you shouldn't be a physicalist. Well, what the physicalist should say about this is, yeah, that is possible. It might turn out that we can never give a physical explanation of consciousness. But we could, and part of the physicalist attitude, the third part, is having the expectation that future physical theories will do better than others, than the current ones, in explaining these mysterious phenomena. So in terms of something like phenomenal consciousness, which has been difficult for physicalists, the physicalist should remain open to that, to its existence, and say, I do believe there is such a thing as phenomenal consciousness, assuming you think that there's evidence for the fact that pains hurt and feel a kind of way, that pencils taste the way they do, that this blue appears to you in this certain way. If you believe that, if you believe all of those things, then the physicalist attitude is going to tell you you should believe in them. Now, if you understand them in such a way that by definition they can't be incorporated into physical theory, then the physicalist attitude says you shouldn't believe in them. You shouldn't, because you shouldn't believe in anything like that. But in general, the physicalist attitude is pretty, this position, this way of interpreting physicalism, is pretty ecumenical about things that aren't obviously ruled out by current physics. Okay, so that's all. So optimism is warranted, and that's not something I've argued for here. So I mean, as I said in the beginning, I haven't tried to give an argument for physicalism, why you should be a physicalist. And the argument comes from the past successes in the various sciences, in physics, in chemistry, molecular biology, and explaining phenomena that appear to be requiring non-physical causes. That's the motivation for physicalism. But all I'm trying to do here is just clarify, do we even have something that is worth arguing for, that's a clear position? And so I think it is. I think that the issue of physicalism is substantive, and it's what supports sticking one's neck out on these tough problems like phenomenal consciousness and trying to give some kind of explanation in terms of physical science. So thanks. That's it.